4 times Jeremy Clarkson tried to put a restaurant on his own land. 4 times it was refused, not delayed, not sent back for revisions, refused, while almost everything else he asked for on that same farm was eventually granted. The car park, granted. The farm shop, granted. The cafe, granted eventually on appeal. A farm track meant to keep mud off the village roads, refused too, which his own planning advisor called almost unheard of. And the restaurant, the one building this entire saga is actually about? Never. Not once. Not across 4 years, 2 separate planning committees, and a formal hearing in front of a government inspector who visited the farm in person, twice, to see it for himself. That should strike you as strange. This is a man who built a beer brand a global brewing giant tried to buy outright. A man whose farm shop generates queues that back up onto a B road in the Cotswolds. A man with a television show watched in more countries than most cabinet ministers could name on a map. If there is one person in Britain who could talk a district council into a restaurant, on paper, it's him. He couldn't. Not once, in 4 straight years of trying. Quick pause. If you like stories where the real answer isn't the one everyone assumes, subscribe now, because this one only gets more specific from here. And the reason has almost nothing to do with Jeremy Clarkson personally, and almost everything to do with 3 words written into the legal status of his farm decades before he ever bought it. We'll get to those 3 words. Stay with this one first, because if you've watched Clarkson's farm and quietly assumed the council simply had it in for him, the real answer is stranger than that, and it explains something the show itself never quite spells out. Start at the beginning. 2019. Diddley Squat Farm is granted planning permission for a farm shop on one condition. Everything sold there has to be grown, reared, or produced on the farm itself, or from within a 16-mile radius of it. A modest condition, for what everyone involved assumed would be a modest shop. It didn't stay modest. The show airs on Amazon. The queues start. What was meant to be a small roadside stall becomes one of the most visited farm shops in the country within months, and Clarkson, never a man to leave a growing business alone, starts thinking bigger. A restaurant. Farm to fork. Beef from his own cattle, cooked and served on the same land it was raised on. He submits the application. And this is where the story most people think they already know actually begins. Ahead of the decision, the council received 53 formal objections and 12 letters of support. Chadlington Parish Council held its own public meeting to settle its position on what it called a divisive and contentious application, and the vote there was inconclusive. The village itself couldn't agree. That September, Clarkson had already stood in front of angry residents at a meeting on the farm, admitting the site had swamped the village with traffic, while arguing it had also brought more trade to the local shop, the cafe, and the pub down the road. January 2022. West Oxfordshire District Council's planning subcommittee votes the restaurant down. Clarkson's reaction to the BBC was blunt. A very bad day for farming. He wasn't alone in that view. But the council's planning officers gave a specific technical reason, and it's the one almost nobody actually quoted in the headlines that week. The proposal, they said, was out of keeping with the Cotswolds area of outstanding natural beauty. If you're still with me at this point, you're exactly who this channel is for. Hit subscribe now, because the next part is where the official reasoning finally gets specific, and it is not what most people expect. Sit with that phrase for a second. Area of outstanding natural beauty. It sounds like a pleasant description on a road sign. Legally, it's one of the strongest protective designations that exists anywhere in the English planning system. Land where new commercial development is judged first, and mostly, against a single question. Does this harm the character of the landscape? It's the same category of protection used to limit development around the Lake District's fringes or the Sussex Downs. It was written onto this land long before Diddley Squat existed, and it was built specifically to stop exactly the kind of commercial development Clarkson was proposing, regardless of who happens to be proposing it. Around the same time, that second application, the new farm track, was also rejected. His own farm advisor, publicly known as Cheerful Charlie, said a refusal like that was almost unheard of. 2 applications, 2 refusals, in the same window, and the pattern hadn't even properly started yet. Here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you, and it comes straight from the reporting at the time, not from speculation. Documents shown to the committee ahead of that January vote confirmed there were no formal objections from the parish council, from Oxfordshire County Council's own transport department, from Thames Valley Police, from Environmental Health, from the Cotswolds Conservation Board, from Drainage, from the ecologist, or from the archaeologist. Every relevant technical authority that actually reviewed the application had nothing to object to. The committee refused it anyway. That single fact is why so much of the public backlash afterwards accused the council of ruling on Clarkson's celebrity rather than the substance of the plan, with one headline at the time calling it a shameful decision. It's a fair question to ask, and it's worth saying that by Clarkson's own account, it wasn't only his farm benefiting from the traffic everyone was complaining about. He pointed to the village shop, the local cafe, and the pub down the road all doing better trade too, even while residents were losing patience with the queues outside their windows. It's also, as you're about to see, not quite the full picture, because the landscape designation itself never needed a single objecting expert to still be legally decisive. 0 objections from the people whose job it is to object, and a refusal anyway, tells you the real decision was never really about traffic, or noise, or drainage. It was about one thing, and one thing only: what an area of outstanding natural beauty is legally allowed to become. Clarkson didn't accept the refusal quietly. He said publicly he'd found what he called a loophole in the regulations, and in July 2022, a restaurant opened at Diddley Squat anyway. Tables, an outdoor kitchen, mobile toilets, the full setup. For a few weeks, it genuinely looked like he'd outmaneuvered the council entirely. He hadn't. On the 12th of August 2022, West Oxfordshire District Council served a formal enforcement notice. 6 weeks, it said, to remove every table, every toilet, every piece of landscaping, to restore the site to exactly how it had been before. The council's language was precise and unflattering. The use of the land was unlawful, and its nature, scale, and siting were incompatible with its open countryside location. The restaurant closed. The queues that had been forming for beef and Yorkshire puddings simply stopped overnight. A few months later, a second refusal landed in the same post. Clarkson had also applied to expand the farm shop's car park from 10 spaces up to 70, with new entry and exit points off the main road. Thames Valley Police's own crime prevention design advisor, a man named Kevin Cox, flagged that the application hadn't adequately addressed potential disorder at peak times. The council turned it down too, calling the design visually intrusive and out of keeping with the openness of the surrounding countryside. 2 refusals now stacked directly on top of the enforcement notice, all inside the same year. Now here's where most retellings of this story lose the thread, because what happens next gets folded into a lazy council versus celebrity narrative. The actual sequence is more specific than that, and the specifics are exactly what explain everything that follows. Clarkson didn't accept any of it quietly. He appealed 2 decisions at once. Appeal A, against the forced closure of the restaurant, and Appeal B, against the car park refusal. A planning inspector named R.J. Perrins was assigned to both. In March 2023, Perrins held a hearing and physically walked the site twice, on the 14th and the 24th, before writing his decision. That decision, published in June 2023, is the hinge the entire story actually turns on. And it's more interesting than a simple win or a simple loss. Perrins split the ruling into 2 parts. On the car park, granted, but conditionally, for 3 years only. On the wider mixed use of the land as farm shop, cafe, and parking, also granted, also temporary, with the 16-mile sourcing rule from 2019 carried straight through, unchanged. Diddley Squat, in other words, could keep functioning largely as it already did. But on the restaurant specifically, the one building that had started this entire saga, Perrins upheld the refusal. His written reasoning said the development had resulted in harm to the area, existing in order to protect the intrinsic character of the area and landscape. 2 entirely separate decision-making processes, 3 years apart, made by 2 different bodies, the council's own planning committee and then an independent government inspector, arrived at the identical conclusion about the identical building. A restaurant on that exact spot could not lawfully be built. This is the part where the story most people tell you gets it wrong. It isn't that the council disliked Jeremy Clarkson or resented his fame or wanted to make an example out of him. The council's own statement at the time said it had a legal responsibility to apply planning law consistently, regardless of who they are, and that it treated Diddley Squat no differently to any other applicant in the district. Whether or not you believe that was the spirit behind every individual decision along the way, the paper trail backs up one specific point. Two completely separate reviews, months apart, using near-identical language about landscape harm, both landed in the same place. That's not obviously spite. That's a protective designation doing precisely the job it was written to do, on a landscape that legally cannot be redesigned around who happens to own it. Even inside the council itself, there wasn't one unified voice. Its own tourism and business support manager argued in favor of the bigger car park, saying it would help vehicles flow safely on and off the main road. It was a legal framework being applied strictly, with individual officials sometimes disagreeing about exactly how hard to apply it. And here's the detail almost every video made about this story skips completely. Not long after, the UK government introduced a change to permitted development rules. New flexibility letting farmers convert existing agricultural buildings into other commercial uses without a full planning application. Journalists nicknamed it the Clarkson Clause. Fans online assumed this was the fix. Surely now, people said, he could simply reopen. When someone asked Clarkson directly whether the new rule meant the restaurant was coming back, his answer wasn't celebratory. It wasn't good news, he said. The area of outstanding natural beauty restriction on that specific building, on that specific plot, sat above the new permitted development rule entirely. AONB status overrides that kind of general planning flexibility by design. Precisely so, protected landscapes can't be reshaped through a national loophole rather than a local decision. The loophole fans assumed had finally opened for him had, in reality, never opened at all. So by the middle of 2024, the position hadn't moved from where it had stood since 2022. The farm shop, thriving. The cafe, legal. The car park, extended, temporarily. And the one thing that started this entire saga, an actual restaurant on Diddley Squat Farm, permanently, structurally, off the table. Not because Clarkson had stopped asking, because the land itself, under the strongest protective planning status that exists in the English countryside, was never going to say yes, no matter who was asking or how many times. Which brings us to the part of this story that actually answers the question in the title, because Jeremy Clarkson did not quietly accept that outcome. He found the one move the planning system genuinely couldn't block. If a specific piece of land can't legally host a restaurant, the answer isn't to keep appealing that land forever. The answer is to buy a different piece of land that already can. That is exactly what he did. In June 2024, Clarkson bought a rundown building near Burford on the busy A40, previously known as the Windmill. Its history alone is worth knowing. Originally a working barn, it was used as a soup kitchen by the Mitford sisters during the Second World War, converted into a pub and restaurant in 1983 by a couple named Alan and Jackie Walker, leased out to tenants after Alan died in 2013, and then, slowly, left to sit empty. Because it already legally operated as licensed hospitality premises, none of the diddly squat restrictions applied to it. No area of outstanding natural beauty refusal. No enforcement notice. No inspector's ruling about intrinsic landscape character. The building already held, on paper, the one specific legal status his own farm could never be granted. He was deliberate about the choice of location too, not a village pub. He'd said openly he didn't want to fall out with more villagers after the backlash the farm shop's traffic had already caused, admitting locals had gone berserk over it the first time around. A main road pub instead, on an A road already built to carry that volume of traffic, where he could sell what the farm produced without dragging more cars through anyone's village. He renamed it The Farmer's Dog, built the entire menu around British-only ingredients, added an outdoor kitchen he called The Farmer's Puppy, and a butcher's shop called Hops and Chops, hung a 20,000-pound chrome tractor from the ceiling, courtesy of his Grand Tour co-star Richard Hammond, and opened the doors on the 23rd of August 2024. Hundreds of people queued for hours just to get in on opening day, the same scene that had played out at the farm shop 4 years earlier, on a site the planning system had never once stood in the way of. No enforcement notice arrived the following week. No inspector needed to visit twice to decide whether it belonged there. The building had already answered that question decades before Clarkson ever walked through the door. The pub gave him a strange new kind of power the farm never could, too. The power to simply decide who gets served. He's since banned a handful of people from the premises entirely, including a national politician, and, at various points, one of his own former co-stars, for reasons ranging from political disagreement to complaining about the price of a pie. None of that requires planning permission. It's just a landlord's prerogative. And it's hard to imagine a clearer contrast with 4 years of committees, inspectors, and enforcement notices. He was honest afterwards about how hard it actually was. Running hospitality, he admitted, had proven far harder than he'd expected, a lesson plenty of pub owners across Britain would recognize. But explaining the decision itself, in an article for The Times, he said the quiet part plainly. We wanted to have that restaurant on the farm last year, and we couldn't. So we thought instead of building a restaurant, we would buy a pub. That is the entire answer, in one sentence, from the man himself. Not a council vendetta finally defeated. Not a fame problem finally solved. Not surrender. A structural workaround to a legal restriction that no number of appeals, applications, media coverage, or public pressure was ever going to move. It's worth being honest about what's still genuinely unresolved here, because the tidy version of this story, Clarkson beat the council, isn't quite accurate either. The restaurant refusal on the original farm has never been overturned. The car park permission is still, technically, temporary, with a restoration condition sitting at the end of it. And this isn't just Clarkson's argument to make. Farming groups across Britain have spent years pushing for more flexibility inside protected landscapes, arguing that diversification, shops, cafes, agritourism, is what keeps small farms financially viable at all in an era of thin margins on the actual crops and livestock. The maths behind that argument is simple enough. A field of wheat makes a farmer far less, acre for acre, than the same field turned into car parking for people who've come to spend money in a shop. Countryside and conservation groups make the opposite case. That areas of outstanding natural beauty exist precisely because once commercial building is allowed to creep in, it rarely stays small, and the protection only works if it's applied consistently, famous applicant or not. That every exception carved out for a popular business today is a precedent someone less careful points to tomorrow. Diddly squat, whether he intended it to be or not, became the highest profile test case either side had ever had, replayed on television to millions of people who'd never otherwise have paid attention to a district council planning committee. Planning policy in this area could shift in the years ahead, in either direction, and nothing about the farmer's dog changes what is or isn't legally allowed back at Diddly Squat itself. The farm shop succeeded in spite of the landscape designation. The restaurant, on that specific plot, never got the chance to. Step back and look at the whole shape of it. A protected landscape status that predates the farm shop, predates the television show, predates Jeremy Clarkson owning a single acre of that land. A council applying that status the same way to a global celebrity as it would to anyone else, even when its own experts raised no objection. A government policy change that fans hoped would fix everything, and didn't. And a solution that only worked because it sidestepped the actual restriction, rather than ever managing to overturn it. This was never really a fight over one dining room. It was always a fight over what a protected landscape is legally allowed to become. And on that particular question, fame changed nothing at all. Think about how differently this plays out for someone with fewer options. Most farmers facing that exact refusal don't have a television deal funding the appeal, a brand profitable enough to absorb a 6-week enforcement deadline, or the spare capital to simply go and buy a second property 12 miles away when the first plan fails. Clarkson's version of this story has a happy enough ending because he could afford to lose the fight over the farm and still win somewhere else. That's not a criticism of the council, or of him. It's just the part of the story that doesn't make it into the highlight reel, and it's worth sitting with for a second before we move on. It isn't a story about a farmer beating a bureaucracy. It's a story about one of the most famous men in Britain discovering that some rules genuinely don't bend for anyone, and being resourceful enough to go and build somewhere they simply didn't apply. If you've made it this far, have you actually been to the farm shop or the pub, and was either one worth the queue? Tell me in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know which one you'd pick, and whether you think that restaurant ever should have been allowed on the farm in the first place. It's the kind of question people in that village still don't fully agree on, and honestly, neither do I. And if you want the real sourced version of the stories everyone else oversimplifies, no invented quotes, no invented villains, just what actually happened and why, subscribe, because there's a lot more from this farm and this stretch of the Cotswolds that we haven't got to yet. Thanks for watching.